Hello, everyone. I was waiting there for someone to introduce me, do the big, and now, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, but it's me. I'll do it for myself. Thank you for those warm words of introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I've just come hot-footed from the Henley and Partners conference, where I didn't go down very well. Henley and Partners, for those who don't know, is the big citizenship by investment company. I'm hoping I'll go down a bit better here. I suppose we'll find out. It's a bit different crowd to the crowd I normally talk to. I normally talk to literary festivals and sixth form colleges, and it's a pretty, I'm pretty confident of who's in the audience and what I need to talk about. But actually, looking at all you guys, you probably could do a better job of talking about this subject than me. So I'm going to do my best, and please don't. They didn't throw anything at me at the Henley and Partners conference. They just looked stony. So maybe model yourselves on them. This is me. I found this the other day. I don't know if you've watched the Marie Kondo show on Netflix. But I was trying to motivate myself to tidy up the house, and I was emptying out drawers that I haven't emptied out for a long time, and I found this, my first ever press card. This is a press card from Pulse magazine, St. Petersburg, where I was the deputy editor in a team of two in 1999 to 2000. Essentially, I was employed, the other guy, Matt, had a drinking problem and subcontracted his job to me. And so I had this press card, which I was inordinately proud of and remain inordinately proud of. And it had this amazing superpower, which was in that time in Russia in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There'd just been a big financial crisis, and the police were feeling, I think, even more cash-strapped than they normally do. And I think possibly some of their ordinary sources of income had dried up. And so they became quite predatory on the street. And they would stop you for imagined offences and then would try and find real offences. And their favourite offence would be to claim that your registration as a foreigner was not in line, which it probably wasn't because it was quite a bureaucratic and cumbersome process. But this card was like a secret weapon. They would say your registration is not in order, and then you would say, but what about this? And they would go, oh, no, a journalist. Oh, dear, we can't mess with him. And they would let me go. So this was my secret corruption force field, which worked surprisingly well in lots of different circumstances. Often when I was, in fact, in the process of committing a genuine offence, this would protect me from them. And I don't know, I mean, those of you who've spent time in Russia and elsewhere in the former Soviet Union will know very well that corruption is a constant irritation and a sort of constant menace. My favourite, least favourite example of it was in Sochi. I'd arrived by boat from Turkey, and I had to hand my passport over at passport control, as is normal, and he refused to return my passport until I paid a $200 fine. The crime that I'd committed was having a business visa in a holiday resort, which was deemed to be a place that only tourists would possibly want to visit. And this, I suppose, was just the pinnacle of a series of irritating encounters with the forces of Russian law and order. But to be honest, as with my press card, these encounters were tended to be more sources of amusing anecdotes to regale my friends with in Britain than actual difficulties. I never actually got in any trouble that I wasn't able to extricate myself from. So I suppose I never gave much thought to corruption, apart from as a source of anecdotes to tell friends at home about. And that only changed in 2014, after the revolution in Ukraine, when I found myself trying to figure out why the Ukrainians had had a revolution, and I kept hearing about the fact that they had risen up because of corruption. And I suppose I set to trying to figure out what corruption was and why it had been such an irritation. And I realized that for ordinary Ukrainians, this is something that had I possibly been less self-absorbed, I would have realized considerably earlier, that for ordinary Ukrainians and ordinary Russians, corruption was not an amusing source of anecdotes for people in Britain, but a real threat to everyday existence. This woman here, someone I got to know in Ukraine, Nina, An extraordinary woman pictured here with her daughter Nonna. Nonna is a haemophiliac, which is the condition. It's a genetic condition that that was afflicted the son of the last Tsar of Russia. It's when you cut yourself and you don't stop bleeding. You lack the clotting factor in the blood that prevents you from bleeding. It's an easily treatable condition in Western medicine now, regular injections of clotting factor, and you can live a totally ordinary life and you wouldn't even know that you had it. It's rather like diabetes. It's very easily managed. However, in Ukraine, despite the fact that everyone had a constitutional right to free healthcare, so Nonna had a constitutional right to the injections of clotting factor that she needed, those injections were not available. The reason they were not available was because all of the money that should have been buying them in the state healthcare procurement budget was being stolen. And this fact totally dominated Nina's life to an astonishing degree. She had taught herself to recognize the smell of blood. So she would sleep next to her daughter, so she knew that if her daughter started bleeding while she was asleep, Nina could be confident that she would wake up and could take her daughter to hospital, where she would hope that someone would be able to dig out from a corner somewhere some of the clotting factor that Nonna needed. As a result, because she never quite knew when she would have to drive to hospital, there was no possibility of her having a drink or of her possibility of her going to a party. Corruption and the fact of her daughter's condition had essentially meant that Nina's life was entirely on hold. She existed to make sure she was always available to save her daughter if required. Had the money not been stolen by healthcare insiders, whether that were in the pharmaceutical industry or in the health ministry, it was a sort of healthcare corruption industrial complex, then her life would have been totally different. She could have lived very well, but she could not. This is the kind of thing that made Ukrainians angry about corruption. And frankly, I think that's probably fair enough. After the revolution, those of you who were there in Kiev will remember this. It was a lot of fun because there was this sort of sudden possibility of exploring all the secret haunts of the former elite who had fled with what they could carry and were now mostly hiding in Russia. And the favorite one for everyone to visit, just because it was just on the edge of Kiev and therefore very accessible, was this one here. Those of you probably recognize it, Mezhihiria, the biggest log cabin in the world, as Ukrainians slightly ironically like to boast. 6 stories high. Its grounds are so enormous that you can really only explore them on a bicycle or in a car. They include an 8-hole golf course, an enclosure for shooting wild boar. Viktor Yanukovych liked to boast of his hunting prowess. In fact, he had a lot of certificates on the wall saying he was Hunter of the Year for a series of consecutive years. The way he liked to hunt is they would bring in wild boars and put them in an enclosure surrounded by a fence, and then he would shoot them, which I think even I probably could get it together to do that. There's, as you can see here, the water gardens. There's just to the left of the palace at the top, a faux Grecian temple, which was imported from somewhere, not Greece. There was a horse painted with a Tuscan landscape. And my particular favorite detail down by the waterfront was this. I don't know if any of you have children have seen the CBBC program, The Dengineers, in which the team of dengineers build dens for children who write to them. I feel that if they'd had unlimited budget and someone had written to them and said, build me a pirate ship, this is what they would have come up with. This is where Yanukovych and his friends hung out. As you can see, the police had been and they put a crime scene tape around it, which I think just sums up the police's response to Mr. Yanukovych. That's pretty much all of it. Inside, it was all, vulgarity, gold plate, heavy furniture, overstuffed furniture. He really had appalling taste. He had a number of these sort of secret residences, all decorated in the same way. Astonishing number of televisions, very few books. In fact, no books. A crocodile skin stuck to the wall. Things like that. He was not a tasteful man, and he also had apparently compulsive need to accumulate stuff. Where he had way more, despite the sheer size of this palace, and it is absolutely huge. You can explore it for a long time. Despite the sheer size of the palace, he had way more stuff than he could fit in it, and a lot of it was just in boxes in the garage, which in a sort of strangely Ukrainian way, the revolutionaries put on display after the revolution, a sort of objet trouvé that happened to have been found in the president's garage. Among the things that were found were some genuinely very valuable objects. There was a Picasso ceramic Kind of amazing. If I had a Picasso ceramic, it would be sort of the centerpiece of my house. He didn't even have anywhere to put it, apart from in a box in a garage. There was a paperweight that had previously belonged to Stalin. I think it had been gifted to Stalin by workers for a steel factory in Donetsk, or Yusufka as it was called back then. Now there wasn't anywhere to put it but a box in the garage. There were also these huge number of portraits of the president, which I can only imagine were made for him as a sort of act of homage from supplicants. The one on the right is my favorite, or least favorite. I think probably the single ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life. You can't really see in this poor reproduction of a photo by me, but that's made out of seeds of different Ukrainian cereal crops. That's off the charts, isn't it, really? So yeah, there's that. But there was some nice stuff too. So here are some icons. He was a very religious man, believed in a particular interpretation of Christianity, and he liked to have these icons. So, I got into a bit of a shtick of exploring these various places. There was another one, Sukholuchia, his hunting lodge where he went and hunted with his friends. I think they had a shooting range and another yacht harbour. It was actually a little bit more small scale than Mezhehiria. It was only 2 stories, but again, a very luxurious place, decorated in the usual style. 2 televisions, big flat screen televisions, the real big ones, sitting down height in the toilets. So I can only suppose that he was interrupted watching a program. We would know he wouldn't miss it while answering the call of nature. And I think it was that final fact that sort of tipped me over from amusement with this man to revulsion. If you think about, Nina's story and Nonna's story, the amount of money that was being stolen, and this was a pyramid of corruption. It was very well organized. He was at the top. The tribute passed all the way up, so he got a cut of every single corrupt deal in the country, essentially. The money was being stolen, so he'd be able to watch in glorious, almost IMAX-style quality, his favorite TV shows while on the toilet. It sort of pushed me over the edge into a degree of revulsion. And I went outside to talk to my friend Anton, who was a member of the Automaidan, which was one of the various branches of the revolution, who had come out with me to Sukholuchia. He was the guy who had the key. And I said to him, that I didn't really understand how they'd let Yanukovych get away with it for so long. How can you let a man be this corrupt? How can you let someone steal so much stuff and not rise up earlier? They'd let him be in charge as president for 3 years. How come they let him last a year? And Anton, who's a very low-temperature individual, responded rather angrily, I thought, by saying, we didn't know. We didn't know all of this. We didn't know hardly any of it. He said, listen, this land we're standing on the sort of gravel drive around this hunting lodge. The land we're standing on isn't even in Ukraine. It's in England. Look it up. And I was slightly taken aback by this, but I did look it up in the evening. I looked up the ownership documents for this little estate in the forest outside Kiev, which is surrounded by a high wall and was at the time guarded by police officers. And it was owned by a Ukrainian company called Dom Lesnика, which means hunter's house in Ukrainian. As I say, Yanukovych was big into the hunter thing. But then that Dom Lesnika, as you could look up in a different registry, was owned by, indeed, a British company. There it is here, Blythe brackets Europe Limited, private company, limited by shares, Suite B, 29 Harley Street, London. Blythe Europe Limited, in turn owned by another company, Astute Partners Limited, also registered at 29 Harley Street. That was in turn owned by a foundation registered in Liechtenstein, set up by an Austrian lawyer called Reinhard Proch. So I kind of knew what Anton meant, right? Because for any Ukrainian before the revolution who had seen these motorcades and thought, who's in that motorcade? Who's going down this suspiciously immaculate road into the heart of the forest and going through this gate that we can't go past to go and see who knows what? Who are these people? Who owns this? And they looked up the information. All they would come up with would be something that looked like foreign direct investment. Some Brit has come here and they've got a very prestigious address on Harley Street, and everyone knows that that's a prestigious street. And they've put their money here, and that's foreign direct investment enriching Ukraine. So what Yanukovych had done here is quite interesting, because by using a British company and a Liechtenstein foundation, he had been able to buy anonymity, buy himself sort of a degree of privacy that was not available for any ordinary Ukrainian. If Anton wanted to own property, he would have to declare his own name on the property register. I, Anton, own this apartment in Kiev. Or if Nina owned property, she had to declare what she owned in Kiev. But because Yanukovych could afford the services of Mr. Proksch and his Austrian law firm, he was able to hide his identity behind this company on Harley Street. And this is interesting because he obviously wasn't the only person who was doing this. The entire Ukrainian elite, of whom there were a relatively small number, but they'd all done very well for themselves, were using exactly the same tricks. The man who owned Seventh Kilometer Market in Odessa, the biggest retailer of knockoff designer goods probably in the world, had his companies registered on Tooley Street, just the other side of the river from here. Richard over there could give plenty more examples of the astonishingly obscure locations of the places where they like to register their companies. Potter's Bar in Hertfordshire was another favourite for these addresses. I recently moved. I left London for a Brexit refugee. I moved to Wales. Thinking I'd escaping all this nonsense. Most of the Potter's Bar addresses, however, followed me and have now moved to the small town of Kington, about 12 miles away from where I now live. It is always somewhere random where these companies are based, and all the time it does the same job. It means that people like Anton, who are trying to find out what is really going on, will look up what their rulers are up to, and they will discover not the ruler's name and not the ruler's relative's name, but an address in Kington or Potter's Bar or Hertfordshire or Tooley Street or Harley Street or wherever. They are hiding their wealth offshore. And that is, of course, what we're all here to talk about because of the name of the conference. But what this made me think about back when I was looking up the ownership documentation for Yanukovych's various salubrious residences was what this means for how we normally talk about corruption and the normal understanding of corruption. Because we all, thanks to Transparency International, we all know what corruption is. Corruption is the misuse of public office for private gain, which is undoubtedly what Yanukovych was doing. He was abusing his public office in order to become inordinately rich, so rich that he didn't even have to put his Picassos on display. That is very rich indeed. He clearly was a very corrupt man. But if we look at what Transparency International does with this particular data, it collates it into the Corruption Perceptions Index. There you go, is a very handy map at the top showing the corrupt countries in a nasty, angry red colour and the non-corrupt countries in a nice, friendly yellow or orange colour. And it's pretty clear that, Africa, Eurasia, South America, Central America, these are all corrupt. Australasia, Europe, North America, we're all not corrupt. But if you look at the way Yanukovych was hiding his money, that doesn't make any sense at all. Yanukovych was stealing his money in Ukraine, moving it via Cyprus and shell companies in Cyprus, owning his property via shell companies in London and hiding his identity via shell companies or foundations rather in Liechtenstein. And yet all of those countries, Cyprus, the UK, Liechtenstein, we're all rated very high on the Corruption Perceptions Index. As you can see, I'm not quite sure why I've highlighted the Netherlands there, but the UK number 11 down the bottom, we're a nice clean jurisdiction. Luxembourg slightly above us, ironically as well. And then you look at Ukraine, all the way, this is actually quite a recent rating, it was much lower ranked back then, Ukraine all the way down in 120th. TI is ranking corruption like it's the World Cup, in FIFA ranks all football teams in the world, they give them a world ranking. So up the top, you've got sort of Belgium or whoever, I can't remember who it is right now. Down the bottom, you've got sort of Bhutan. Everyone plays against everyone. But corruption doesn't work like that. It isn't an international championship of who is the most corrupt or the least corrupt, because corruption is intrinsically transnational. Yanukovych could not have got away with the stealing that he did had he not been able to hide his money offshore. The biggest retailer of knockoff designer goods in the world, in Odessa, would not have been able to hide itself so well had its owner not been able to hide it on Tooley Street, and so on. So this understanding of corruption, and no disrespect to Transparency International, which I admire enormously, is completely wrong. And so I was thinking about this back in Kiev in 2014, and I was thinking about what Anton had said about this palace not being in Ukraine, it's in England, look it up. And I thought, well, it isn't actually in England, is it? Because you can visit it, it's nailed down to Ukraine, it's just legally not in Ukraine. So where is it? Where is this country that he owns this stuff? And so I created for myself a joke name. I said, well, he owns it in Moneyland. He keeps his money in Moneyland. And actually, the more I thought about Moneyland, the more I thought it's actually quite a helpful metaphor to describe what's going on with the world. If you look at investment flow statistics, the money that moves between countries, we can see that there is a big hole. The world essentially owes more money to itself than it owns. It's almost like Mars is a major foreign direct investor in the world, and this is the money that is hidden offshore. Thanks to Gabriel Zuckman, who we'll come to in a bit, we know the volume of the kind of money that is held offshore. It's a huge amount, maybe 8, 9, 10% of all the financial assets in the world are held offshore, and this is the money I decided was in Moneyland. And having decided this, I thought I'd look into where this came from, because obviously the world hasn't always worked like this. It didn't used to be possible for a corrupt official to hide their money offshore in this way. I think we can safely say there have always been corrupt officials. As long as there have been officials, some of them have been corrupt. But they haven't always been able to hide their money in the global financial system. So when did this begin? Well, fortunately for my purposes, being a journalist and liking to tell nice, simple stories, there was a period when it began, a precise moment when it began. But to understand that, we need to go back in time, in a great time machine. I'm putting the Nelson room in a time machine, and go back in time to 1944, to the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, which I think is one of the great, strangely overlooked moments in world history. I think it's very important and doesn't get nearly enough attention, though there are recently published a couple of good books about it. The Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire is when the United Nations powers, the Allied powers, got together and decided to create a new financial architecture for the world. They're in this sort of fortunate position. If you're trying to change the world's financial architecture, normally it's like trying to re-engineer a plane while it's still flying. It's difficult to change it. But in 1944, that plane had crashed. There essentially was no global financial architecture. So they could re-engineer it from the ground up. And they decided to try and change the world financial architecture so there would be no more world wars. There'd been 2 world wars in quick succession, and the idea was to try and stop there being another one, which I think they probably all agreed was a worthy aim. So they looked at what the causes of the Second World War had been. Well, obviously, fascists, Nazis on the march, they'd caused the war. But what caused the Nazis and the fascists? And they said, well, that was they were kind of came to power because of the misery of the Great Depression. What caused the Great Depression? Well, this was a result of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and associated financial crashes that followed it, as the speculative capital was sucked out of Europe and back into the United States, where it didn't seem to do any good either. So they thought, what we need to do is to get ahead of this and prevent there being these big flows of hot money in the first place. If we can prevent money flying hither and thither across the world, you'll prevent these big asset bubbles, and that will then prevent the crashes that follow and the depressions. So they imposed, among other things they did at Bretton Woods, creating the International Monetary Fund, creating the World Bank, they also imposed strict capital controls. It was very difficult to move money between countries, except as long-term investment. You needed government approval. You couldn't just say, there's a good investment opportunity in the German stock exchange today and a good one in Shanghai tomorrow. You had to really think about what you were doing with your money. And this was an amazingly successful system. It's sort of kind of the French call it the glorious 30 years, this period up to the mid-1970s when there was sort of almost uninterrupted economic growth. There was, in fact, globally uninterrupted economic growth. There was no global recessions. There was a quality increasing around the world, increasing prosperity, kind of an extraordinary period. I think when people talk about how great the 1960s were, this is pretty much what they're talking about. But it had a couple of downsides. For particular groups of people. Beatles fans and, in fact, Rolling Stones fans will recognize that they had significant problems with the tax rates charged in the 1960s and 70s. George Harrison lamented in Taxman that the taxman took 19 shillings for every one that poor George was allowed to keep. And the Rolling Stones probably fled into tax exile in France in order to record exile on Main Street. With a tax rate, an effective marginal tax rate of 95%, there was significant demand for tax avoidance solutions, tax evasion solutions as well. Fortunately, there was an easy way at the time to evade tax. You just put your money in the boot of your car and drove to Switzerland and gave it to a banker, and they would put it in a hole in the ground for you. This was great for all concerned, and it was such a successful and popular tax dodging strategy that by the mid-1960s, 5% of all the money in Europe was stuck in a hole in the ground in Switzerland. You didn't get much of a return for your money. In fact, quite often you had to pay for the privilege of keeping it in a hole in the ground in Switzerland, but at least you weren't paying 95% tax on it, so that counted as a win. So that's one group of people who really didn't like the Bretton Woods system, essentially rich people who had to pay huge amounts of tax. I'd like to point out, I'm not only saying this is George Harrison, the other members of the Beatles, I suspect, also at it, and probably other people too. So that's one group of people. The second group of people were right here in London. And the reason in London, in the city, people didn't like it is because the city had been the financial engine for the world. Under the British Empire, and then even during the dying days of the empire in the 1930s, this was where all the deals were done. This is if you had to build a railway from Argentina to Brazil, the money was raised here. If you had to move a cargo from San Francisco to Shanghai, the money was raised here. Everything was done here. But under the Bretton Woods system, because money was hard to move, all of that business moved to Washington, to New York rather, where the dollar was, and the dollar was now the most important currency. That's where all the deals were done. So London was moribund. There's a fascinating social history or oral history of the City of London based on interviews done in the 1950s and 60s, and which gives this totally extraordinary insight into what London was like then. If you think that the city now, you see these sort of hordes of commuters coming across London Bridge in the dawn, or you see these sort of glass and steel canyons of the big banks. It's hard to imagine, but into the 1960s, there's still bomb sites in the City of London that they hadn't bothered to rebuild. The chairman of Lloyd's Bank described being in charge of Lloyd's at the time was like driving a powerful car at 20 miles an hour. There was just nothing going on. There's one banker, my favourite anecdote is one banker who remembers how every lunchtime he would get on a boat to Greenwich and drink 2 pints on the boat to Greenwich, and then he would get there, have a sandwich, and drink 2 pints on the way back. And it was before the sort of fast clippers that you get now, so the whole round trip would take him like 3 hours. And no one would even notice he'd been gone, or that he was 4 pints down when he came back from lunch. It was just fine. There was nothing happening. There was one guy, a war hero, who was employed by the Bank of England. His only job was with a pencil and a ruler to cross out names in a ledger of people who no longer had an account at the Bank of England anymore. Labour was cheap, no one had anything to do, there was nothing going on. So we have a lot of money in Switzerland not doing anything, and we have a lot of bankers in London not doing anything. And sooner or later, it's inevitable that someone would realise that if you could just get these two together, magic could happen. And that someone were a couple of bankers in Warburgs at the time. One of them, Ian Fraser, mercifully wrote a memoir about this, which is useful because it means we know all about it. And they decided, under the direction of their boss, Sigmund Warburg, to try to see if they couldn't set the wealth in Switzerland to work. And if they could get those dollars and other currencies sitting in Switzerland, they could set them to work, they'd be able to rival New York and possibly go up against New York in the deal-making business. And it shouldn't have been possible. It shouldn't have been possible for them to move money around in the way that they decided they wanted to do because of all the capital controls that were in the way. But they were resourceful people, and it took them 9 months, and they figured out a way of defanging the capital controls of the continent of Europe. And what they created was this. I actually think this is the most consequential invention of the second half of the 20th century. Other people may disagree. There it is. This is the first ever Eurobond issued in July 1963 for $15 million. The borrower says Autostrada. It wasn't actually Autostrada. It was someone else pretending to be Autostrada, but it doesn't really matter. This was arranged by Warburgs. It's $15 million raised in Switzerland, sold to clients in Switzerland, organized in London for an Italian borrower, denominated in the American currency, issued in Schiphol Airport to avoid tax. The coupons redeemed in Luxembourg, again to avoid tax. What you have here is the first ever retail arrival of offshore. Offshore had existed as a wholesale market between banks. With the Eurobond, it becomes a retail instrument. Wealthy people were suddenly able to put their money somewhere where there was no regulations. Here it is. No regulations at all. This was a bearer instrument. Whoever held it owned it. There was no record. It was totally anonymous. The tax was paid. There was no tax paid. The coupon could be paid anywhere. It could be redeemed anywhere. It's an absolutely amazing thing. If your money had been stuck in a hole in the ground in Switzerland, and you're having to pay maybe 0.5% or 1% every year for the privilege of keeping it there, suddenly your wealth has been set free and you're earning 5.5% a year. An amazing thing, the Eurobond. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of demand for this. Within 2 years, the Eurobond market is worth $1 billion a year. Now it's probably the biggest market in the world, certainly up there. And it has, levered open. It created in its wake, it levered open all sorts of markets, because as soon as there was one offshore market, everything else had to be offshore. So deregulation followed quite quickly after the invention of the Eurobond. The Bretton Woods system collapsed 8 years after the invention of the Eurobond, with Nixon taking the dollar off gold, and all sorts of astonishing consequences followed, some of them good, depending on who you are. And who was buying the Eurobonds? Well, again, thanks to Ian Fraser, we know who was buying the Eurobonds. Most of them were being bought by people he refers to as Belgian dentists. Belgian dentists are the London slang term for wealthy European tax dodgers, the kind of people who had enough money to put it in the boot of their car and drive to Switzerland and put it in a hole in the ground. That's most of the purchase of Eurobonds. But more importantly for our purposes, and tying it together with Mr. Yanukovych at the beginning, were among the second class of purchasers were what he referred to as your usual fallen South American dictators. I actually love that phrase. It's the word usual that makes it so brilliant. These are kleptocrats who had looted their South American republic, been overthrown in a revolution which were plaguing South America a lot at the time, fled, were living in the south of France, in pretty straitened circumstances. They had money in Switzerland that they weren't really able to get to. And what were they to do? Now they could buy this, and suddenly they were in the funds. An amazing thing. You've stolen all this money, it's stuck, and someone comes along and sets it free. Unsurprisingly, you're pretty delighted about it. But this didn't just have an effect on the incentives of people who had already stolen a load of money and stashed it in a hole in the ground in Switzerland. It also affected the incentives of people who might in future decide they want to steal money. Because if you can steal money and have the opportunity of earning 5.5% tax-free, totally anonymously forever on that money, it becomes much more attractive to steal money. Simultaneously with this, almost exactly simultaneously, fascinatingly, there was a sociologist called Stanislaw Andrzejewski of Polish origin, but working at the University of Reading, who was based and traveling a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. He suddenly noticed this explosion in corruption. Corruption was suddenly taking on shapes and forms that had never been seen before in terms of the amount of money that was being stolen. This is happening in places like Nigeria, places like Equatorial Guinea, places like Angola, huge quantities of money being stolen. He created, well, actually, he refashioned an old word to describe what he was seeing, and the old word he refashioned was kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is what happens when corruption hits offshore finance, and it just created amazing things. This is some stats, again, from Gabriel Zuckman's book, Hidden Wealth of Nations, which you haven't read, you should. Amount of money kept offshore, you can see the 1960s. That dot is when Eurobonds get invented, and the amount of money just goes up in a pretty solid diagonal line all the way up. And you can see the places that are most afflicted by this in the column on the left. Share of financial wealth held offshore, that is a lot of money being held by Europeans offshore. But it's only 10% of our financial wealth. The American statistic is a bit weird because they have their own onshore, offshore places, so we can maybe slightly discount that. But if you look down the bottom, Russia, 50% of all wealth held offshore. I understand the statistic for Ukraine is broadly equivalent. This is the problem that the people in Ukraine were rising up against. This was the problem of offshoreness. And I find it extraordinary. This is an incredible amount of money. 8, 10, 11% of all the money in the world is offshore, and yet it gets very little study, very little sort of debate about what to do about this or how much money there is. My favorite demonstration of the fact it gets very little study is this, as a quote, which I think is coming up, from Mark Thompson, who was at the time acting head of the Serious Fraud Office, giving evidence to Parliament. How big is the problem of economic crime, and can you quantify it? Big and no. I mean, the fact that the head of the Serious Fraud Office is unable to even put a vague figure on the size of the financial crime that is going through the City of London is, I think, a pretty damning endorsement of academic research over the last 40 or 50 years. This isn't a new problem. This has been happening since the 1960s, since the invention of offshore in the 1960s. And right, anyway, I could go on. I'm not going to. Okay, I'm going to crack on. So, yes, offshore. But what I found interesting looking at the Ukrainian elite is that offshore for them was not just about money. I have a favorite oligarch who I can't really talk about or by name because of various legal issues. But his career is a very fascinating demonstration of the fact that offshore is not just about money, because he acquired an awful lot of money in various profitable and slightly questionable business ventures in Ukraine, often extracting a lot of money from various state budgets. But his behavior while he was doing this was very interesting, because he wasn't just keeping that money offshore, though he was, a lot of it thanks to our friends in Nevis and various other Caribbean islands. He was managing to hide his ownership of that money very successfully. But also, if you look at what he was doing with the rest of his life, his children were living in southern Europe. So his children, they're kind of offshore too, right? That's interesting. If you send your children to live in southern Europe, maybe educate them in Switzerland or the UK, then your children are offshore. If you have a desire to visit your children without having to go through all the hassle of applying for a visa, and you decide to purchase citizenship from one of the nice people I was talking to this morning at the Henleying Partners Conference, then your citizenship is kind of offshore as well, right? Offshore is an endlessly expandable concept. And if, when some irritating journalist decides to try and write an article about you, you can employ some nice lawyers here in London to write him a nice, kind letter to point out that that would be unwise, then your reputation is offshore as well. Offshore isn't just about money. Offshore is about everything. You can live in Moneyland. It's not just somewhere that you keep your assets. So I thought I would explain or demonstrate via my particular favorite example of this, quite how extraordinary this can be, by recourse to my favorite publication. I don't know if any of you recognize the font. This is Hello magazine. I've had a soft spot for Hello magazine ever since I was a boy, and I used to read it while my mum was getting her haircut. People who live these astonishing, glossy, expensive, tanned lives, who only ever speak in perfect quotes. Anyway, Christina Estrada, any of you who had the Pirelli calendar, I think in 1989, may recognize her. She was a supermodel. This is her on the occasion of her 50th birthday, where she had a surprise party organized by the gentleman in the white tuxedo down there, Walid Al-Jaafari, who she was married to. Walid Al-Jaafari was a Saudi billionaire, may he rest in peace, he's no longer with us. His wealth was described by a High Court judge here, because this is a story that doesn't end well. High Court judge, his wealth was described as immeasurable. He had an enormous amount of money. His father had got started in the family business, he had continued it and done very well, and he had married Christina Estrada and organized this huge party, 50th birthday. And they'd done it on the edge of the empty quarter in this luxury resort and flown in all their friends who had come from all over the world on private jets and had made this amazing cake. It's not a very good quality picture, but there at the bottom right, she doesn't look like someone who eats much cake. It's a regular proposition, but bottom right, look at that cake. It's like the size of a bed. And anyway, it's kind of romantic, actually. I'm being rude, but it's a kind of romantic story. Bottom left is their daughter, the princess of this union. It's like a sort of Disney story, and they're very romantic. And she tells this very romantic, lovely story about all of it. And, and they live pretty well, actually. This is their house. That's just on the edge of Windsor Great Park. I believe it's been valued at £100 million, but I think when you get to that kind of level, it's an almost entirely notional valuation. It's basically priceless. Nice place. That's where they normally lived, but they had a kind of peripatetic existence. Sometimes they're in their palazzo in Venice, sometimes in their place in Gstaad, depending on the time of year, sometimes in Jeddah, sometimes in Beirut. They lived well. So this is super romantic, and isn't it lovely? And I like Hello magazine, and this is all great. But the romantic edge of this story is slightly detracted from by the fact that 2 days before the interview with Christina Estrada, talking about how romantic her relationship with her husband was published, this happened. This is Walid Al-Jaafari marrying someone else. I think he's dressed like a usual fallen South American dictator, but anyway. But that's his new wife, exactly half the age of the previous one, 25 years old, MTV presenter from Lebanon, and she did very well. I understand the necklace alone is worth $1.5 million. And they had this amazing party, fancy dress party, in the Palazzo, actually, in Venice. And it was all great, and he's obviously a Saudi gentleman, so he can have up to 4 wives if he wishes to. So he was obviously well within his legal rights to do this. But Christina Estrada saw this more as a moral issue and objected vociferously to what he was doing. And so she said that she was going to get a divorce. I demand a divorce, she said. And I wasn't there, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm guessing that was more or less what she said. And he thought long and hard about this and a long, happy life they'd spent together. And he, again, I wasn't there, I'm putting the thoughts into his head, but he apologized said, I'm sorry, it was a moment of madness. I will get rid of the new girl. You're the only woman for me. We'll stick together. Please take me back. Give me a second chance. And she did, which may have been unwise, because Walid Al-Jaafari was either very clever himself or very well advised, because as soon as she backed down on the divorce threat, he got in his jet and flew across the Atlantic to St. Lucia, an island in the Caribbean, which was represented very well at the conference I've just been to. And he had a chat with the Prime Minister, who sadly is no longer Prime Minister, and arranged that if he were to build them a diabetes research centre, they would make him ambassador to the International Maritime Organization here in London. So he returns to London. His name is published in the London Diplomatic List. And then once it's published in the London Diplomatic List, he gets his lawyers to send a letter to Christina Estrada informing her that he said, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times. Doesn't have to do it in her presence. And she is no longer his wife. And she would get some money in due course. She didn't respond very well to this, really, but it turned out that there was very little she could do because he had diplomatic immunity. He hadn't just put his money and his reputation and his children and his wife offshore. He'd put everything offshore. He was totally embedded in Moneyland. He was legally immune from everything. So her lawyers, I understand it was Mishcon Rea, wrote to St. Lucia and asked them to waive diplomatic immunity. This was clearly not a political case. There was no need for him to be diplomatically immune. But St. Lucia replied in the negative. So at that point, the British government wrote to St. Lucia and said, please, will you waive diplomatic immunity? And this is more serious. St. Lucia is a Commonwealth country, a recipient of UK aid, the Queen's face is on their currency, and so on. But they replied and said, sadly, this is a matter of principle. He is an ambassador, he must enjoy all the perks of the job. And so this case came to court. And there's this fascinating court case in early 2016, fascinating court case whereby essentially her lawyers are arguing that this man is not really an ambassador. And amazingly, the judge agreed. The judge said this is a sham. He'd never been to a meeting of the International Maritime Organization, doesn't know anything about marital stuff. This is quite clearly a sham, and he should not have diplomatic status. At which point our government completely panicked. Because you can't have judges going around the place deciding who is or isn't an ambassador. Just imagine if a judge in Moscow decided one day that actually the British ambassador wasn't really an ambassador and he could be arrested for anything they decided. It clearly wouldn't do. So there was an appeal astonishingly fast, I think within 3 weeks. There was an appeal and a new judge was found and she came up with a different decision and his diplomatic status was upheld, which was very nice because he hadn't got rid of the new girl. He had installed her here in a converted church in Knightsbridge, I understand, worth £35 million. I actually know someone who's been in this house to say it's really, really nice. Swimming pool in I suppose what they probably still call the crypt, I don't know. There you go, look, you can see the church window up there, isn't that nice? So there you go, Moneyland, amazing place. You can put all of your money in it and all of your everything in it, and if you're particularly wealthy, you can be totally immune from anything that you decide. I've only got a couple of minutes left, I think. Actually, I don't know how long I'm supposed to be talking. I'll just keep rabbiting on. A lot of you may be thinking that, of course, the world has changed and Eurobonds are no longer what they used to be. You can't travel around the world with a briefcase full of pieces of paper and be anonymous and tax-free anymore. And of course, you're absolutely right. Everything has moved on. The Eurobond market is no longer this opaque, paper-based system. People can no longer drive to Switzerland and stick them with the money in the boot of the car and stick it in the bank anymore. You know, we've all seen to these old schemes are no longer possible. But the world hasn't changed as much as you might think. This is my favorite graph from the very long report into the Danske Bank money laundering scandal. This is the nationality of the owners of the bank accounts which moved the suspicious money in Danske Bank's Estonian branch. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's unlikely in a conference like this that any of you haven't. 200 billion euros, probably the single biggest money laundering scandal of all time. And look at the grey graph right there. British-owned companies. British-owned companies were the single biggest holder of accounts at Danske Bank. And this is, I find really interesting about this. This is a Danish bank. And I'd like to remind you, looking at that, remember that Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index slide right at the beginning? Denmark, #1, the least corrupt country in the world. Anyway, Danish-owned bank moving huge quantities of money via its Estonian branch, using British shell companies, and a lot of these British shell companies, of course, weren't owned in Britain. They were owned via general partners in the Marshall Islands or in Nevis or wherever, and the money is coming from Russia and Ukraine and Azerbaijan and elsewhere, and it is going into the global financial system. So again, what you have is this game of jurisdictional twister, the same game of jurisdictional twister that we saw with the Eurobonds, with them borrowing little bits of law, little bits of regulation from lots of different places and creating something that magically is not anywhere. Danske Bank account owned by Lantana Trade LLP, which is in turn owned by 2 companies in the Marshall Islands, was every bit as anonymous and tax-free and offshore as a Eurobond was back in 1963. It's just a digital version of this. Offshore has gone from analog to Moneyland, which is why it's exploded to such an extraordinary degree. Just a brief, in parenthesis, as a demonstration of how well regulated the British corporate the British company registry is, after the allegations against Lantana Trade LLP, which is the account holder that first aroused the whistleblower suspicions at Danske Bank, after they were broadcast by CBS in the United States, Marshall Islands moved quickly to strike the 2 companies that owned the LLP off its corporate registry. Britain has not taken any action of any kind. Danske Bank has, to this date, not once been mentioned in the House of Commons, which is amazing. So there we go. It's depressing. It's going to have to be said. We keep thinking that we're improving, and we keep changing, shutting stable doors, closing loopholes, but new ones keep opening all the time. And frankly, sometimes it feels a little bit depressing. But a friend of mine in Ukraine who I work with has a wonderful philosophy about it all being a little bit depressing sometimes. And when I said to her, after they'd done a very big, in-depth report into corruption in defense procurement and the use of Cypriot shell companies to move money around, and the next year the same people were back doing exactly the same scams, nothing had changed except for the fact they were using different shell companies. I said to Dasha, is it not a bit depressing that you did all this work and essentially nothing's changed? She said, no, it's nonsense. Things have changed. They're using different shell companies. That means I annoyed them. There you go. You've got to get your wins small. I think she says if you can go from 2% to 3%, that's already good. Don't think about getting to 100%. So to leave you with a little bit of good news, Ukraine healthcare procurement has changed. After the revolution, this astonishingly brave and committed health minister, Ulana Suprun, brought in international agencies to do the procurement while they built an entire new procurement agency from the ground up, and prices were slashed astonishingly by 45% in the first year, in the second year by 18%, and it is now so much cheaper for Ukraine to buy medicines that Nonna has all of the clotting factor that she needs. And here she is, out of the house, which is amazing, not something that happened very often before, eating an ice cream. So her life has improved, and Nina occasionally gets to go out for a glass of wine, which is a win. So there you go, moving from 2 to 3% in Ukraine. That's all I was going to talk about. I've been talking for an hour or so. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you don't, I totally understand. That's fine. We have a question from the distinguished gentleman in the front.
Yeah, thank you very much, Oliver. I've got the usual books, and thank you for leading into the cryptocurrency this afternoon, because I do have on my Kindle the last Tom Clancy book, essentially written from his notes that he left behind, Commander-in-Chief, which has a lot about Luxembourg, which I noticed when you mentioned Luxembourg, everybody laughed, and I think you were laughing. It also has a lot about cryptocurrencies, not unconnected. My question is about your very powerful points about Danske. You mentioned Russia, Ukraine, of course, and other countries, one of which is Moldova. Now, when the New York Times broke the story about Banca di Economy, which, for those who are not aware, I imagine most people will be aware, brought down the government in Chisinau, and of course the BBC did that marvellous documentary about the use of an address in Edinburgh. The New York Times Europe quoted the EU ambassador in Chisinau saying, I do not have an explanation for you as to how this could have happened in such a small country. Well, you and many others had very strong explanations from before the story broke, before. My question, therefore, is, as the European Public Prosecutor's Office is established next year, and there's talk of more direct powers for the EBA or a central EU anti-money laundering body, do you think that will work? And really, are the European countries in cooperation with the EU, with the UK, regardless of Brexit, how do we cooperate? Are they really taking this seriously? Do they understand? Do you believe they are committed to trying to get on top of this?
No, I don't think so. I think as this rather telling report from Europol about the number of suspicious activity reports sent by different EU member states. I'm not saying that the volume of suspicious activity reports sent is necessarily an indicator of good things. Obviously, you have over-reporting and so on. But I do think it's remarkable that more SARs were sent in the average week from UK institutions than Malta sent in the 8 years between 2007 and 2015. There are definitely weak points in the European financial architecture. Some of them the same countries represented in the conference I was at just before this one. Cyprus as well. I think we've got issues. But I mean, it's quite, I don't know, it seems to be quite pleasing that a whole load of dodgy banks in the Baltics have been knocked off one after another. So, I mean, that's good. I think in a way, I mean, it's a sort of slightly be careful what you wish for in a way, because if all of this money moves to Dubai, we'll have no oversight of it over it at all. So, which is a big problem, obviously. So I don't know. It seems, like I say, it's like as soon as you close one loophole, another big one opens somewhere else. I don't know. I should look out the Tom Clancy book, though. I think that sounds excellent. And on the cryptocurrency, I highly recommend everyone listen to the podcast The Missing Crypto Queen by Jamie Bartlett, recently out from the BBC, about the unbelievable OneCoin. It's not really a cryptocurrency, it's a pyramid scam, but it's amazing. Anyway, great podcast. Good job.
Hi, Oliver.
Hello.
I just wanted to ask you about your appearance at the Henley conference.
Oh, yeah.
Why did you decide to, presumably they approached you, to do that? And I wondered if you just reflecting on that, your last point about it being depressing and thinking of getting, ahead of the various wheezes that sort of appear. And when it comes to citizenship by investment, were you there? I don't know, I'm speculating, but in a way of thinking, well, if I can reform and impress them on the importance of making sure you are checking who's applying for citizenship, that might be a good thing. What was your thinking?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with citizenship by investment. I mean, I think the global citizenship's kind of setup is unfair. It's not fair, the fact that, my dad was born in Canada, so I get a Canadian passport, but someone whose dad wasn't doesn't. I mean, it's insane, really. So buying a passport isn't necessarily a bad thing, I don't think. I think the way that the industry is set up is pretty bad, and I thought I'd go and tell them that. I think that it has a crisis of legitimacy, and I mean, they talk about it as an insurance mechanism, but in the way that it inflames the anger against plutocrats, it's like an insurance mechanism that makes the thing it's insuring against worse. So I thought I'd go and tell them that. They asked me to go, so I did. I like them, though. I think it's a fun place to talk to people. And the really good thing about it is if you go to a conference like that and say, I don't think this is a very good idea, then people come up to you afterwards and say, here's my card, let's chat, because I don't either. And so, no, I mean, I think you've got to talk to everyone. It's fun. I think if you only talk to, readers of Prospect magazine, much though I love Prospect magazine and I admire all of their editors and everything, I think you maybe don't expand your bubble so much. I recommend Prospect magazine, by the way, particularly an article I did for them recently about British anti-money laundering regulation, which features the faculty office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which improbably enough is one of Britain's 26 regulated anti-money laundering authorities. I think it's a sign of how seriously Britain takes anti-money laundering regulation that we have entrusted His Grace with manning our financial ramparts. I've actually got quite a lot of time for the Archbishop of Canterbury, but I think he has stuff to be doing that shouldn't necessarily involve money laundering. Anyway, leaving that aside. Yes, there's a gentleman over there. Maybe the Archbishop of York could have a separate one.
Hi, Oliver. Thanks very much for the talk. I was just wondering about, you mentioned that Danske Bank hasn't been mentioned in the House of Commons at all. Why do you think that is? I
really genuinely don't know. I think it's amazing. I mean, it's been in the British media. It's been in the international media. It's, as you know, as that graph made clear, this is very much a British, a scam with a very strong British connection. The fact that the whistleblower was British, I don't know why it hasn't made more waves here, genuinely. I mean, maybe it sort of seems slightly counterintuitive that a Danish bank could be involved in something dodgy. Maybe it's that, and maybe that no one wants to get their heads around it. It seems really strange. But partly, I think that, in the pre-2016 days when David Cameron was around, he made a big thing about international corruption. It was clearly one of his hobby horses. Since then, the prime ministers haven't cared so much. They've had other interests, whatever their interests might be. So maybe it's that, maybe there just isn't the kind of general institutional support for it. But I think there is an amazing lack of awareness in Whitehall and in Westminster in general about the vulnerability that the British corporate registration system poses to the world economy. I was talking about this at a think tank event at RUSI, and there was a guy there from the Cabinet Office who was just like, well, what's wrong with Companies House? So it's just the idea that someone who's involved with regulating Companies House would have no idea what's wrong with Companies House is really depressing to me. It's a giant, it's like you could drive $1 trillion through it, it's a hole that big, and yet, no, it's fine, apparently. They've got, 4 people checking 600,000 incorporations every year. It's bonkers. So I think there's a lack of realization of the damage we've done, in the last 8, 9, 10 years with this new company registration system. Who knew that if you'd let anyone go online and create a company without checks, that it would end up with a load of trolls and fraudsters? I mean, it's like these people never use the internet. Anyway, sorry. Hello.
Oliver, thank you very much for, I think everybody would agree, was a first-class, educational, enlightening and very entertaining presentation. To what extent do you think that the UK is an economy that I think 75% of which is dependent on financial services has backed itself into a corner, first and foremost? And could you talk a little bit more about your perception of, collusion is a strong word, but places like the BVI and Nevis and all the rest of it are crown dependencies. So what is your sense of cooperation between UK PLC, I suppose, as a centre, and this offshore network? I mean,
Nevis isn't anymore. Nevis is independent now, but there's still, because it's Commonwealth, there's a connection. But obviously BVI came in, Anguilla, Turks and Caicos. They come up again and again and again. I was in BVI earlier this year, actually. I went from BVI to South Dakota. Go the other way around. I'd recommend doing it if ever you're going to do it. Go from South Dakota to the BVI. But it's a lovely place. But yeah, it is talking of places that are dependent, completely dependent, on incorporation. It's, before incorporation came along as a revenue stream in the 70s and 80s, it relied on handouts from London. It was a very impoverished place. It's now, very prosperous and doing very well, and that is built on incorporation. And I think that debate is not being had in the UK. We've essentially given them a big slap and say, you're not allowed to do this anymore. We haven't said, well, actually, we've encouraged you to build an entire economy based on this for 30 years. Why, we're not going to help you out. That problem is obviously much more acute in BVI and Cayman, Jersey, Guernsey, and so on than it is here. But like you say, financial services are important here too. I suppose you don't know till you try it. I think there is the whole point of Eurobonds and then the invention of the Euro-dollar market before the Eurobond market, the creation of the offshore market in the City of London was essentially a way of building a financial services industry by undercutting the regulations of the United States. This is the origin story of City of London as a modern financial centre. it is obviously a nerve-wracking prospect for any government to say, you know, let's see what happens if we don't. You know, will the money stay here? You know, and I can understand why some of them might look at that and think that's a chance they don't want to take. But you kind of have to start taking it, I think, a bit, you know, because you can't go on racing to the bottom because it turns out, you know, there isn't a bottom.
I also really enjoyed your talk, and I think it's very interesting hearing about the global problem. Many of us here probably want to hear about the global solution to the problem. And especially under David Cameron, there was a lot of talk about transparency and information about ultimate beneficial ownership being more readily available globally. Do you think that is a solution here, or do you think the problem is more structural?
It's part of the solution, certainly. I mean, I think we need to know who owns everything. You know, it's amazing how, you know, going away from the usual suspects, the sort of BVIs, I mean, even Delaware is astonishingly opaque. You know, so I think we need to, we do need, whether those UBO registries are completely public, you know, I can understand if you're the director of a company, you might not want your home address published for anyone to read it. I can see that, but some form of unique identifier with a name to make sure that people can't game the system is absolutely necessary, and open to everyone. You know, I think the BVI system is a big improvement on what they had before in terms of their, you know, the Virgin system they've got now, but it's not good enough that it's only law enforcement people can have a look at it. Everyone needs to see it, because if you one of the great things about the UK registry, though it's a mess, is the fact that anyone can look at it. We can all see how crap it is. You know, it creates the sort of crowdsourced policing system. You know, and so I think that would be useful everywhere. But I think really, to my mind, you know, we've already got laws are already okay. We just need to start enforcing them a bit better. You know, I mean, you know, we had after the Panama Papers leaks, as a London lawyer, I think, Luke, you wrote about it, didn't you, who had set up the companies and the bank accounts for Leyla Aliyeva from Azerbaijan and not declared that she was a politically exposed person. He got fined, 75 grand, I think, by the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, but he's not been prosecuted. You know, if you're not going to prosecute something as blatant as that, you know, what's the point of even having a prosecution service? So I think more prosecution, more people in jail. That's what I want.
Thank you. Very fascinating presentation. I'm actually from the BVI. I like the idea of Moneyland.
Moneyland it's a place to live.
Moneyland existed with the Eurobonds. It existed in different forms since then, and it will continue to exist. I want to go to the picture that you ended with in terms of Nina Nana being able to go out and enjoy an ice cream. It seems to me that a lot of times what's missing out of this argument, giving the different permutations of Moneyland, is a fundamental reforms that are necessary in the home countries. You ended with the fact that, you know, some fabulous minister of health and so forth was able to get more money into healthcare and get her the service and so forth that it needs. I think in the international debate, and going back to the lady's questions, chasing Moneyland and trying to fix Moneyland, that is one route, but I think there's going to be greater success if we fix the fundamental issues that is driving. So to me, Moneyland doesn't drive what's happening. Yes, Moneyland might be an enabler of what's happening, but there's something more fundamental that causes that kleptocrat to be able to do what he needs to do. And I think in the international debate, more focus needs to happen on that point.
It's a really good point. Obviously, that the solution is not only at the financial system end. You know, we need to make sure that people are not, that theft is not tolerated in places like Ukraine or elsewhere. But I think, I mean, one of my favorite academic studies I've read recently is of a supermarket that changed over to, there are a series of supermarkets that changed over from having people you bought goods from to those machines that you scan and they tell you the unexpected item is in the bagging area, those machines. And there was just a study of what that did to the behavior of the customers. And the most interesting finding is that theft increased by over 100%. Essentially, if it's easy to steal, people steal. That's the point. I think that just seems to be innate in human nature, that if, and we have created a financial system when it's just very easy to steal. If you look at asset recovery rates, despite the best efforts of all the people at this conference and elsewhere who do amazing work on this, they're way below 1%. We're below 1% of 1%. It's if you steal $1 billion and stash it in Moneyland, it's basically a one-way bet. You get to keep it, and that is, I think, a problem. I think we can encourage places like Ukraine to try and sort things out, but what do you do about, say, Equatorial Guinea? Who do you talk to? Or Angola, who do you talk to? It's really hard. Once a country, or Russia, once a country's been comprehensively captured by essentially a mafia clan, what do you do? So I think we need to look to ourselves. I mean, I think the BVI has made a lot of progress, and shout out to the BVI. And I'm not sure I like the way that Parliament went ahead and imposed transparency on the BVI without asking them. I thought it's not very democratic. But I think we all need to get our houses in order, and Britain first and foremost. I've probably been talking too long. Yes, I have. Thank you for listening, everyone. You're all great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to Oliver Bullough for that excellent presentation. I think we can all agree that was very enlightening. His book is available in all good bookshops. Yeah, cheers.